So, Michael, so happy to have this conversation with you about brains and societies. Please tell us a little about yourself as a human being and how you wandered into this particular line of work.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, David. I'm very happy to be here and in conversation with you, and had a chance to see some of these other interviews. So it's very exciting to be a part of this project. Um, yeah, so me as a human being, certainly a good place for us to start thinking about relationships. I'm a father of two. I have two small children, married to my wife, and we live in our family here in San Francisco, California. And Gosh, let's see. I guess being a father and is let's just say that that's fairly central to my identity. But I think as a human being, I think of myself strongly as a scientist, and as a and as a psychiatrist, and so that I suspect that's probably where we'll end up talking about today.
Just a little bit more about your academic background. Like, what was your major in college? How did you develop an interest in brain processes and that kind of thing?
My interest in the brain probably goes all the way back to high school, really. And in some sort of strange turn of events, I ended up in like a introductory program for high school students who want to get exposure to the sciences. And I had really hoped to get into a wet lab and do molecular biology, and strangely enough, ended up in a plant lab, and was very disappointed when I found out that I ended up in a plant lab. And as it turned out, I ended up working with a molecular biologist who studied plants, but also studied myelin sheath, which is the membrane that surrounds neurons. And she was really interested in lipid biology, and also had an interest in plant lipid formation and the use of plants as medicines. And one thing sort of led to the next, and became really, really interested in this question of, what the heck is the brain? How does this work? And so I came to college with an interest. I went to UC Berkeley and wanted to study the brain. There was no question for me about that. I just wasn't sure of exactly how to do it. Again, sort of looking for research opportunities as an undergraduate, was lucky enough to end up working in the lab of Ralph Freeman at UC Berkeley in optometry. And this is a very basic visual neuroscience processing lab, and had my first exposure to something called single neuron recordings. And the basic biology or experimental paradigm you may be familiar with, where you place this electrode into the brain of an organism that you might be studying, and you present a stimulus or something on a screen and measure the neural activity that responds to what was presented to the organism. And this process to me was immediately alive, immediately dynamic, and it just completely was enamored with this process, that we could in real time watch biology sort of play out, and a biology that was sort of imminently experiential. I mean, you see something on a screen and you see it as a human being, you know it's there, and then the organism, you see the neurons sending off their spikes in response. So this type of this experience had me hooked, and continued to do this type of work as a graduate student, and where I was at the University of Rochester.
That was my alma mater too, by the way. That's where I got my undergraduate degree.
Wonderful. Yes, I noticed that in your biography, and I know now that you're still in New York, and so I think very fondly of upstate. Um, and so, but one of the things that I guess really struck me about being able to record from these neurons was sort of how idiosyncratic the whole process was. Like sometimes you'd go in and you'd record from neurons and you just get a stream of activity when you'd present a stimulus, and maybe you'd come back, you'd present the same stimulus and you'd see nothing, or and it just was really wondering, so what's going on here? What is it about the variability in this system? What is the complexity of what's going on? Is there something about our experimental paradigm? And that's a question that's really sat with me for I've been struggling with that one for a long time. And around these same time, I was at University of Rochester and simultaneously pursuing a medical degree, which turns out to be quite an endeavor. Don't necessarily highly recommend medicine and try to do both at the same time. But for me, this was part of what I was failing to get from the neuroscience side, which was human experience. Just as we're engaged in conversation right now, I want to actually know what's on the minds of the organisms, of the people that I'm working with, and I want to try and make their lives better. And so I think that although I didn't realize it then, it's pretty clear that I was going to head towards psychiatry as a career and really sort of wrestle with both improving our science from the neuroscience of psychiatry, but also improving it, particularly because of the importance of human relationship and working towards healing others in those relationships.
That's great, Michael. Thank you so much. And of course, this is among the most technically challenging of any topic, that you take what an organism does on the outside and then understand how that's actually accomplished mechanistically on the inside. And when you look at something like those single neuron recordings, and you realize, that one neuron is part of a network of how many millions of neurons, and we need to understand their interactions and all of that. It's amazing that we've made as much progress as we have, and so let's spend a little bit of time on that. I'm a little bit familiar with this kind of research. For example, on the outside, the organism makes a decision. It does this, not that. And on the inside, what's happened is some kind of competition among neurons. Different categories of neurons are firing at different rates, and as soon as one category receives a threshold, then something else happens, and then that leads to the behavioral event. And so there's a distributed process taking place on the inside. In fact, I think it's safe to say everything that takes place on the inside is a distributed process. What else could it be? And yet it leads to sensible behavior. In other words, functionally sensible behavior on the outside. So that's my account, but you're the expert. So maybe you could cover that ground in a little bit more detail. Talk about an experiment or something which kind of maps a sensible behavior on the outside to the mechanistic process on the inside.
Right. So no small task here. I think that there's the level of scale here. So I think one of the distinctions that we might want to make in our conversation is sort of thinking about the differences in terms of thinking about measurements from single neurons or one neuron at a time, populations of neurons, and then of course measuring from an entire brain, as one might accomplish using something like functional magnetic resonance imaging or sort of these brain scans. But just following what you're asking right now, I get the sense it's about that what's going on at the level of the sort of single neuron level and those sorts of spiking activity. Is that my understanding you correctly?
Yeah, or any other way you might want to take this conversation.
Maybe I'll illustrate it in terms of how I stumbled across this experimentally, which is there's a region in the brain, the human brain, part of parietal cortex. It's similar in the monkey brain, where I did most of research as a graduate student. And I think when most neuroscientists, at least over the past 10, 20 years, ask about decision making, usually what people are thinking about are interactions between these neurons in parietal cortex and neurons in frontal cortex. So sort of frontal parietal interactions. And the reason why we tend to sort of narrow in on these particular neurons is that when you record from neurons in lateral interparietal region, say in a monkey, and the monkey needs to make a very simple decision, say turn a knob left or turn a knob right in order to earn a reward in a particular task. What you see is this kind of buildup in activity in single neurons. And then, of course, as you average across a population of neurons, you see this buildup of activity. And you can find a lot of remarkable, there's a lot of remarkable information that's contained in that buildup. So there may be the time at which that buildup peaks corresponds with the time that the monkey needs to make the decision, or the magnitude, the strength of that activity might correspond with the sort of degree of certainty that the animal may have about the situation. Am I sure I need to go left or do I need to go right, especially under more ambiguous situations where it's maybe not entirely clear. And so this is, but of course there's what you're talking. So this is some of the focus, sort of anatomical focused studies that are done in decision making. But then there's, of course, I think what you're also getting to, which is there's a distributed process here, and so that buildup of activity may actually reflect an integration from all the other additional information that is coming into the organism. We may be listening to one part of the brain, but of course the whole other rest of the brain is still active. So visual information, for example, or perhaps information from memory, and that as that activity builds, it's integrating across. And this is sort of one of the decision, like you sort of said, reaching the threshold to bound sort of decision-making type hypotheses.
Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to make the jump from an individual brain to a society. But before getting to human society, I want to visit insect societies. And in particular, some work that I know well by Tom Seeley. I don't know if you're familiar with his work on honeybee colonies. He has a book called Honeybee, two books. One's called The Wisdom of the Hive, which gives you a kind of a flavor of what he's getting at. And then a second book called Honeybee Democracy. And what he shows very clearly is that the process of social decision-making in a honeybee colony is very much like the interactions among neurons within an individual brain. And so the comparison between a social brain and an individual brain is a very strong comparison in this case. And one of the things he studies is how they swarm. Basically, when a hive gets too big, it splits, and then one half of the colony goes and they form a big cluster in a tree, and then scouts go out and they investigate different cavities, and they have to make a decision as to what the best cavity to go into. And it turns out that they can do this with considerable sophistication. Tom has shown that. They examine the cavities, they've 6 or 7 different factors in mind. And all of this gets reported back by the scout bees. They come back, and on the surface of the swarm, they dance, and the famous bee dance, which indicates the location of the, in this case, of the cavity. But the quality of the cavity is represented by the length of the dance, And then other bees are observing the dances, and they actually don't make a decision themselves. They actually pick a dance at random, and then they go to check out that particular cavity. But because the best cavities result in the longest dances, that results in a statistical bias, so that gradually the number of bees that are dancing on behalf of the best cavity increases and increases. And when it passes the threshold, then a decision gets made, and a whole process gets initiated in which the swarm takes off and flies to the best cavity. My God, I mean, if that's not amazing, what would be? And Tom has worked that out in just amazing detail. And in his articles, he compares it to some of the research on rhesus monkeys. It might even be your work, for all I know. I don't remember the authors, in which the monkeys have been trained to look at a screen, and there's a number of dots moving to the left or moving to the right. And the monkeys have been rewarded for turning their head in the direction that most of the dots are moving. And then with these single neuron recordings, they're recording basically single neurons that fire when they see a dot moving to the right, or fire when a dot moving to the left. And that same kind of buildup leading to the monkey turning its head is what takes place. And so the mechanistic process among the neurons is literally much like the social interactions among the bees. And the intelligence of the hive in making its decision has been demonstrated just as well as the intelligence of the monkey turning in the direction that gets it a reward. So when it comes to comparing a single brain with a social process, that's as good as it gets. And so the idea of a society having everything that we associate with a mind is secure, at least in that comparison between an organism with its brain, multicellular organism with its brain, and a social insect colony. So could you comment on any of that? Just, I don't know if you're familiar with that research or not, but any of that before I move on, make my next move here, which will be towards human society.
It is interesting just to kind of hear, if I understood correctly, the initial impetus for this, right, was that the sort of hive got too big. Is that the idea? And they're separating, and they need to find a new home.
That's part of the life cycle of a beehive, yeah.
It's part of the life cycle, right? Which is just sort of interesting in and of itself, that that it's a sort of fission process. But in any case, the decision making element of this, I mean, it's so truth be told, I'm not an expert in decision making, and so I'm not sure I have I don't have a lot of deep knowledge about it, but I do have some experience having done those sorts of experiments. I think there's clearly going to be some differences, and I don't know about the sort of functional specialization, right, of insects and sort of how they come together. One of the things that I guess I would emphasize in the especially in the rhesus monkey work is that where the decision, how to say it, the experimental paradigms themselves are highly constrained. So we don't, in real life, there's rarely a situation where there's kind of a one and done decision. Clearly, those do exist. One of the things that's really was interesting to me is that in those perceptual decision-making tasks, right? So the dots are going left, the dots are going right, very similar sort of things. The neurons would make this decision about which way, or the monkey would make a decision, and of course the neurons would show corresponding activity. But then immediately after making that decision, the neurons would show a very different pattern of behavior that often needed to reflect the larger context in which the decision needed to be made, such that if you're say you're just turning left or turning right on the basis of the dots, what if then you actually have to kind of navigate around in your world to sort of find out where to go? And so this is one of the distinctions is that what was just immediately a particular decision now, as the context changes, is just a radically different decision-making environment. And so, there's, I hesitate to use the word sort of information because that could set us down a whole nother rabbit hole, but there's a certain kind of information processing, right, that's happening here in terms of those dynamics and the time scale over which that decision making is happening in larger context of the organism. So I think there's probably there's some fairness in the analogy that's drawn to the beehive, but I'm not sure how far I can stretch it.
Yeah, well, that's a fair point. I don't think anyone does in the absence of research. And when you think that, and more often than not, we end up being surprised, and we have underestimated the abilities of the organism or the social insect colony in this case. And also, I mean, it's amazing. All of this is in the context of learned activities. These are not like genetically evolved adaptations. These are associations and what we do on the basis of associations that have just been learned over a relatively short time period. And still they're so sophisticated that not only do you learn to turn your head, for example, but you might also have to then learn how to actually act upon that in some complicated way based on barriers and obstacles. And yes, you can do that too. So and yes, that has a mechanistic basis that will take us years and decades to unravel, even though we do it obviously every day of our lives, right?
Yeah, well, if I might just jump in for 1 second, in that sense, I might almost give the beehive a lot more credit in this analogy, which is to say that in the rhesus monkey experiments, these are highly overlearned paradigms. So the monkeys kind of figured it all out extremely well and is highly habituated to what's going on, whereas in the case of the beehive decision making, I mean, this is like they're headed out to the great unknown. I mean, they don't know where they're going to put their hive, right? So I think that there's probably even more credit is due to the beehive in this case, perhaps. I'm not sure, but just to underscore the importance of the habit and learning versus in truly novel situations, right? Is a very, very different brain dynamics, and we don't see the same sort of overlearned buildup of activity when you just have no idea what you're going to do.
Yeah, so now we've already consolidated the comparison between an individual multicellular organism and a society, in this case, the social insect society. Now let's make the jump to human society. But before we get to large-scale human society, let's make a stop at small-scale human society. And here, what I want to say, what I want to assert, and then I'll justify it, is that connection is about as good as the connection with a social insect colony. And based on other conversations in this series, and based on the best of our current knowledge, what we can say is that the genetic evolution of our species is like the evolution of the ultrasocial insects. We are, in a sense, an ultrasocial primate species. And the small human group, the size of a hunter-gatherer group, is in fact a cooperative unit, a highly cooperative unit, And of course, that cooperation must have a mental dimension, a mechanistic dimension. And so it's actually not far-fetched, not science fiction, to actually look for and expect social interactions among individuals in a small group that are trying to do something like hunt or gather or or especially to make a decision that is a bit like the individual brain and the honeybee colony. And the conversation that's most directly related to that in this series is with Gary Sternberg and Jim Cohen. Jim is a clinical neuroscientist, so I think pretty close to what you do, Michael, at the University of Virginia, and he studies. Are you familiar with Jim's work and his holding hands paradigm? Okay, well, let me briefly describe it. And in fact, I won't describe it in too much detail because I can just direct people to the thing. But essentially, what they both show is that everything that well, actually, one point I want to make is that intellectually, we are in a period of history that's dominated by individualism. In other words, the expectation that the fundamental unit is the individual organism, that everything social can be described in terms of the thoughts and actions of individuals. And so the idea of society as an organism in its own right, or group as an organism in its own right, while once common, if you go back a century or into the 19th century, you'll find that it was actually the dominant idea, has for the last 70 years been almost nearly totally eclipsed by the idea that it's the individual that's the self-contained cognitive unit. So it's the individual that perceives, the individual that remembers, the individual that makes decisions. And the idea that all of these things could actually be group processes, fundamentally group processes that take place in small groups of people that live with each other and do things together, is new and amazing against the background of individualism, even though it has long roots in the social sciences. So it's against that background that the work of Jim and Gary are reviving that and thinking about all aspects of human cognition. Memory is a great example. I mean, so much of what you need to remember is not in your head. It's in the heads of other people around you, and thankfully you know who they are. and that's the way memory always has been. It's evolved. So there's one, and Jim's experiments basically put people under stress experimentally within an fMRI machine under threat of electric shock, and then doing that under 3 conditions: alone, holding the hands of a stranger, or holding the hand of a loved one. And holding the hand of a loved one has this tremendous calming effect. Why? Because what the brain is acting upon, based on the sensory information of holding hands, is that it has social support in addition to personal resources, social resources in addition to personal resources. And the way that Jim puts it, because we've always lived in cooperative groups, never alone, always in the context of cooperative groups, our brains and bodies evolved to integrate our personal resources and our social resources at all times. And so, obviously, usually subconsciously. And so when you remove social resources and a person is alone and therefore only has access to personal resources, the brain and body interprets that as an emergency situation, as an emergency situation. And so, anyhow, that's a flavor of what Jim and Gary do. So, against the background, I'd like to have you talk a little bit about the way that you think about the social human brain, the human social brain, in the context of small groups, which is, I would say, the natural human social environment. And then we're going to take a big jump to large-scale human society. But first, let's make a stop here at the scale of small groups, the natural human social environment, what we call the environment of evolutionary adaptedness for our species.
I have come across that work before. One of my colleagues at University of California, UCSF, Josh Woolley, runs a lab called the bonding. They call themselves the band lab. I think it's like bonding and something emotional attunement, something to that effect. And so there's just this huge area of study with respect to social neuroscience. And what I love about the experiment that you're articulating from James Cohen is that it just emphasizes the effect to which individualism has permeated our experimental paradigms. We were talking about weaknesses of experimental paradigms earlier with regards to rhesus monkeys, and you're studying one monkey at a time. Here we're just studying one human brain. We put them in the brain scanner. Not only that, we put you in this room. You're shut off from people around you, and I don't know if you've had an MRI done, but I've had my fair share, mostly for research. And so you go into this room, you have to lie down. These are the aspects. You have to lie down. You're in the dark and you're in a tunnel. These are the things that I think we fail to appreciate. So I think just that alone is going to cause stress. I don't remember the exact stress paradigm that was used. My own experience of being in the brain scanner. There's this goggles that you get to wear because you're lying flat, right? And so you're just looking up and you're seeing that you're in the tunnel, and it's a little anxiety provoking, claustrophobia. There's this mirror that allows you to look down, so that you can see through your feet and to the command module. And when you look into the command module,
and now act natural.
act natural, right? What really struck me about this experience was how comforted I felt when I was able to actually see my colleagues through the window. And know that they were there, that I was not alone stuck in this machine. So even our experimental paradigms themselves, right, already set this up. So yes, there's a whole field of social neuroscience, right? I think that where now we're finally beginning to maybe, put people in the same room and use maybe two EEG machines or two EEG caps so that we can see not only how we're synchronizing our behavior in communication, but also neural activity becomes synchronized also on that basis, skipping over all the details of what is sort of meant by that synchronization process. But yeah, what I really like about this idea is it's drawing attention to the fact that we're by definition in relationship, and that's where we started our conversation. We want to know who I am as a human being. I want to know who you are as a human being. Our relationships that we have, and I think where part of your question was also about our close knit relationships, our family units perhaps, or extended family. Those sorts of connections. We are not individuals, right? In the sense that we think we are. Everywhere we go, we carry the memories of our fathers and our mothers and our ancestors in us, right? And so all those patterns of behavior, are those mine? Wait a minute, or am I just acting like my father was back when he faced the same situation? And So there's that way in which the memory gets carried forward in us, even though we perceive it. We have this sense of some sort of agency around it, as if, this is me. And that may be one of the areas that causes challenges for people, right? It was when we tend to over-identify or misattribute certain aspects of our personality without and take over ownership of them, perhaps unnecessarily, and to sort of, rather than sort of reconnect to the larger group. But that may have taken us a little bit off the track of where we're going.
No, not at all, Michael. Absolutely. In fact, just the opposite, because what you pointed to is the idea that cultures, being transgenerational, really must be considered some kind of organism in their own right, which is, of course, what Teilhard was all about. Cultures do adapt members of the culture to their environment. They're often very sophisticated. I mean, I've spent my life studying such things as religious belief systems and how well, just like an organism, a religious belief system basically prepares members of the church, members of the community, to make the right moves, to do the right things at the right time, behave this way towards that category of people, that way towards another category of people. They're adaptive at the group level. You can show it, and somehow it replicates itself as the individuals, the members of the culture, come and go. The culture replicates themselves. Young people assimilate the culture, so on and so forth, and it evolves, and so on and so forth. So the idea that cultural entities are a kind of a life form, and that we have to attribute an anatomy and a physiology and some kind of nervous system to them, is implicit in what it means for a culture to be adaptive, once again, by a process of selection. This doesn't just self-organize. And I think that leads me to my next major point. But I want to consolidate something here too. Insofar as we can say that for a large-scale culture, not just a small group, then we've advanced our thinking from the multicellular organism is an organism. It's the quintessential organism. Social insect colony is an organism. A small human group can be an organism. And danged if a large human cultural system can also qualify as a organism. Okay, now, in all of those cases, those entities are units of selection. Clearly, the multicellular organism and its brain and everything else about it is a product of eons of selection at the individual level. The natural selection has been winnowing functional organization for endless generations. Same true of social insect colonies. Colonies, at any particular generation, they vary in how well they function. And only the ones that function best are the ones that make it to the next generation. So too for small human groups. So too for larger human cultures by a process of cultural evolution. And so the message here is that functional organization, what qualifies an entity as an organism with a brain, requires a process of selection. And when that process of selection doesn't happen, doesn't exist, then what do you have? You have an entity which is very complex, very interconnected, but does not qualify as an organism. It doesn't do sensible things. It doesn't make the right moves. And so the most important question, I think, both for basic understanding and also moving into the future, if we want the noosphere to be um, any kind of global cooperation, we need to select it as such. It's not going to just emerge. And so the ability to recognize functional organization where it exists, and also to recognize where it doesn't exist, and to have the tools to do that. I mean, at the individual level, compare a healthy organism with a sick organism, or an organism that's a brain that's functioning as it should, and a brain that's had a stroke or is somehow impaired. The methods have to be able to detect that. And what I find is that often people who think about this, they don't make that clear distinction, and they focus on such things as, let us say, interdependence, extreme interdependence. As if this implies some kind of functional organization. And they think that something like a noosphere can evolve in entities when they're in fact not being selected. We shouldn't expect it. We shouldn't. And so I wonder what you think about all of this, and then we can pursue it in a number of ways. But actually, let me make one final comparison just to nail it down, in part because this is the subject of some of my other conversations, between a so-called smart city and another kind of city. So if you look at cities as a unit, what you find is, and they're all complicated, they're all interconnected, they've all got traffic, for example, to focus on a specific example. But whether that traffic flows smoothly, as opposed to getting all tangled up in traffic jams all the time, most of the time the traffic doesn't function smoothly. And if you want it to function smoothly, you better select the street plan and the stoplights and all of that. You're going to have to actually do work in order to get a city to function adaptively, let's say with respect to traffic flow. It's not going to self-organize, it never will. And so work is required. And then we need to be able to actually identify that kind of variation, something working well as a system versus something not working well as a system, realizing that in all cases, there'll be very complex relationships, there'll be a great deal of interdependence, but that's not the deciding factor. That's not what we need to know to distinguish function from dysfunction. So I've said a lot. And so now please respond, and then we can get to some of your specific examples, because you have fascinating examples of decisions, societal decisions having to do with such things as Black Lives Matter and racial equity and things like that. So I'm eager to get to your own work along those lines on social processes against this background, this stage that I'm trying to set.
I appreciate the background and the stage, and I think you're right. That needs a lot of. We need to have some clarity around what that is, especially since I really appreciate and very fundamentally agree with this idea that self-organization and complexity, interconnectivity is kind of not enough. It's probably an understatement, frankly, right? And that it's actually it was a major interest of mine. When I was an undergraduate, was to just go to the library and find as many books I could find on complex adaptive systems, and sort of see how these things are mapping out, cellular automata and chaos, complexity theory. Just really exciting. I think just beautiful work in some sense. I'm getting a few different threads from what you're saying. One is the question of complexity, and interwoven in all of this, of course, is the unit of selection and evolution. But another piece here is the question of normativity. So what's good, what's bad? And so, it's a distinctly biological sort of question, right? I mean, but that is not isn't really built in, at least from my opinion. I don't think within the sort of the fabric of evolution or of biology. Certain species, for example, may go extinct, right? I mean, that is this good? Is this bad? From the perspective of the species in competition, of course, it's a travesty, I think, as a human being and a member of a community, when our actions lead to the dramatic loss of biodiversity, for example. And so, what is it about humanity, human beings? We start to ask these questions about what's good and bad, whereas perhaps I don't know that other animals kind of ask the questions in the same way and have the kind of reflection on it that we do. And I guess I think that that's really a particularly relevant because of the idea of this beehive and the swarm. Clearly, there's sort of collective intelligence. Would we call it collective mind? And is there a distinction between those two? That could be a question I might want might be worth examining. Because if that's the case, or a smart city, for example, right? Is what makes a city smart? A city free of traffic, or a city that that's jam packed, having lots of traffic, but maybe comes alive in other ways. I'm not sure. So there's an interesting terrain there that where we start to we raise questions of value, which I think are great, and I think we should raise those questions, but to wonder a little bit more deeply about it on that level. So maybe that's a little bit of my background of kind of how I come to some of these questions.
There's no way to get around ethical questions. The idea that science, or especially economics, can be value free, and in economics they make a distinction between what they call positive and normative economics. Normative is we're really trying, we have values, we're trying to achieve those values. Positive is just describing economic systems the way they are, and orthodox economic theory pretends that let's just stick to positive economics. Let's not go there normative. But really the new paradigm of economics, you can't do that. I mean, there's just everything we do is value laden unless we actually have goals, normative goals. In other words, in plain English, unless we decide what we need to do, what should we do as a group, let it be by consensus. What do we want? Not what do you want or what do you make me do? What do we want? And work towards that. Then things are not going to turn out right. And yes, it's a very complicated world. There's indirect effects. There's unforeseen consequences. It's multidimensional. It's all of these things. But nevertheless, if we don't actually deliberately make goals and aim for something as a target of selection and then steer towards it, then cultural evolution will take place, but it will not lead to global solutions. And that's what takes place in nature more often than not. Every species is evolving. Every species has its adaptive strategies. And the aggregate result of that is not an organism. It's not. I mean, laissez-faire doesn't work any better in nature than it does in human life. The only biological units that function well are the ones that have been selected as units. And that includes such things as microbiomes, very large ecosystems of microbes function well for their hosts because they've been surviving and reproducing along with their hosts. So functional organization exists in nature, sometimes at very large scale, such as a microbiome, trillions of organisms, thousands of species, but only because that process of selection has been operating, or at least that's what I would say. So against that background, let's talk about a little bit about the work that you've done um, on decision making at this large scale and such things, such basically um, topical issues such as racial equity, the civil rights movement. Talk to us about how you've been monitoring that based on in some way that's roughly similar to what you do with individual brains.
Yeah, so this was really our initial project, our kind of foray into this this area, and I should say is really I can't take credit for the entirety of this work. There's a team of us. Yeah, so there's Parham Portavood, who you may have come across with Human Energy. He's done some work with the website, among other things. He's a cognitive data scientist from UC Berkeley, just graduated as an undergrad, just earned his undergraduate degree this past spring. So he does a lot of our analysis, but is also intimately involved in the theoretical discussions. Along with Parham, you may have come across. I think you know Boris Shoshitaishvili, who there's my best attempt at his last name. Hopefully, it won't. Boris has been with us, and the other is Frederick Steele, who is a Jungian analyst in San Francisco, who's been a mentor of mine for a long time, and we've had our long-standing project has been to kind of make psychotherapy, psychodynamic psychotherapies in particular, to reintegrate those theories with neuroscience. And it's mostly just a freewheeling theoretical exploration. But once he heard about this project, he seemed like a natural fit to continue that conversation. So it's a whole team of us. And really, I should say that, we didn't set out. This was not a very goal-directed project, speaking of goals, in the sense that we really had no idea where we were going. It really, to us, is the question of the analogy. Does this fit?
That's the random component of a cultural evolutionary process.
We were just interested in this question of the analogy. I mean, can we even think of society in the same ways that we think about brains? But also motivated by Yuval Harari's question about our society and algorithm, are human beings neurons or microchips, and do we just sort of all come together and process information? And so that was a little bit in the background for us, was our individual members of society like neurons, and that's how we ended up with decision making, since we had it was just sort of global interest to the group. And so then the question is, if with what we already talked about with decision making in the brain, we know there's some dynamics in there, but where would we begin with society? What level does society make a decision? Does it make a decision to enter a war, for example, or to close the borders or to pass a law? Are these the decisions that society is making? Those are the most observable decisions, I suppose, on some level. And I think at the time we were motivated by current events. We were in the pandemic and thinking about those events, but also about the different members of our society. And here was in the midst of this pandemic, we had this outpouring of protest, of shifting in consciousness, I think, and a lot of conversations about questions of racial equity, and so there's a lot that was on our minds about that, and I think one of the things that we were wondering is, why is this happening now? Why now is this happening? And in part, I think there's I think it's fair to say it's sort of a mistaken view that, well, once we pass the laws, then the decision is made and then everything is sort of solved, right? That which obviously that's just not the case. I mean, we could say everybody's equal and clearly everybody's not. And so that we were one way of trying to get at this question of change in societal view, societal perspective, was to actually look at public opinion data. And so that, I think that's one of the challenges in exploring this analogy, is that we could just talk about it, and that's one thing, but is there any data? Is there anything that we can get our hands on to sort of apply the same methods we might, or at least roughly apply the methods we might use in neuroscience to see how society functions? And there's not a lot of continuous data, right? This is really sort of a modern thing that we collect the amount of information that we do. One place that one thing we're really wondering is, do people express opinions like a neuron does, right? And so we talked earlier about the neuron that is responding to a decision, particular decision. And what we also talked a little bit about the context and how that can change the activity. What's really dramatic about this is that for a long time, neuroscientists thought that you'd study from one neuron and it would say a neuron that responded to, going left, leftward moving dots. And it had always showed some activity when you were going left, but never showed activity when the dots were going the other direction. For a long time, neuroscientists really thought that these preferences, they call them preferences or selectivities, were really sort of hardwired in, or at least soft-wired in enough that they didn't really change much. And one of the things we've learned over the past 10, 20 years in neuroscience is that remarkably, even in sort of more primary visual areas, you can see some dramatic changes in neuronal selectivity, or both in the context of a particular task or over time. This phenomenon is called representational drift. And so, this degree of plasticity, one, to me, made the argument that neurons are microchips or sort of logical operators starts to become a little bit, it challenges that. It makes it a little bit less tenable, that they're not operating on a sort of logical circuit level and can show changes and not particularly reliable. And so what might happen at the level of society? Do we see those sorts of shifts in opinion? And of course we do, right? We do know that you and I can change our opinions. We can make new decisions that we didn't make yesterday about the future. And we looked at public opinion polling over time. And one of the things we found is that around the passage of the, it was a few different civil rights acts, but I think it was the 1964 passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Prior to that, most Americans who were polled felt actually that Blacks were treated pretty fairly. Something like 60-70% of society thought that everything was fair. And then right around the time of the Civil Rights Act, there's a little uptick, and all of a sudden, okay, some people start to think maybe they're not treated so fairly. Maybe there's some racism in our society, or that they're not treated fairly. And so that public opinion poll changes. But then immediately after the passage of the act, that it drops right back down again. And the majority of society says, okay, we're equal now. We passed the Civil Rights Act, and public opinion. And it was really not until you start to see, we didn't see changes in that public opinion poll until really the 21st century. Up until the 21st century, finally crossed the threshold where more than half the population is starting to say, okay, there's inequality, there's inequity. And this is a pretty remarkable finding. But it reminded me, and this is all a kind of analogy, right? I mean, this is speculative, but it reminded me of certain aspects of decision-making dynamics in the brain, which is to say that there are some brain, there's that initial decision that needed to be made is, are we going left or are we going right? But it's not a decision that we make once. It's a decision that we need to make continuously and need to continue to reevaluate. And so there are other neurons that continue to report about the status of the experiment, the status of what's going on. And those neurons seem to show a very different time scale in their buildup and activity. And so this is sort of what we started to, where we started to draw some analogy between decision-making but it's in some sense, while it is a study of decision-making, it's in some sense, I think, actually really more fundamentally a study of changes in perspective, changes in information processing, and the dynamics of those changes in information processing, and really wanting to highlight that aspect of the brain and how it works, that it doesn't really operate like a computer does.
Yeah, so I think this is great, Michael, and I think that if I were to design a research program around this, here's how I would do it. And it could be done at a number of scales. It could be done at a small scale or a large scale. And the first thing is to be able to identify the how well a group is functioning as a group, as a cooperative unit, in outside terms, phenotypic terms, before we look on the inside. And that's quite easy to do. There's some groups, for example, in which the members of the group, they clearly regard themselves as members of a group. They have a common objective. It's what are we going to do? There might be differences of opinion, and so there's decision-making process, but at the same time, at some point it's understood that we need to make a decision. And even if I don't disagree, then we'll go ahead with it. All of this kind of thing, which we can recognize and measure. So it's not just a matter of opinion, that this is a group that's capable of making good decisions. That happens at any scale, including the national scale. One of the conversations in this series is with Darren Acemoglu, who wrote the book Why Nations Fail, and which is a comparison of nations as basically whether they work well or poorly. And that maps onto whether they're inclusive or extractive. So compare a despotic society with a democratic, inclusive society, and you will see this, differences. So now, and so compare, for example, a society that's in a civil war or close to a civil war, a society whose members are set against each other. They don't regard themselves as a member of the same nation, for example. They're simply trying to get their way. And when they succeed, then that's for a while, but the other side hasn't changed their mind. They're just waiting for their next opportunity and so on. That's clearly a conflict situation. You wouldn't say that that's a group that's actually even trying to make a collective decision. So you can determine all of that on the outside, basically. Phenotypically, you can determine whether a society is functioning well or poorly as a collective unit, and then look on the inside, and then do these studies and see what's happening with the individuals and the sharing and the so on and so forth. So I think that would be really exciting in order to make that distinction on a functional basis and then look on the inside. But has that happened? Is that part of the research program? I mean, is that basically what you have in mind, you and your colleagues have in mind? I'm curious.
Yeah. No. So I think how I'm understanding a little bit of what you're asking here, right? So. I think there's initially, right, an effort here, which is to say, okay, does this analogy hold? That society works like a brain. Should we just apply the tools of neuroscience? And I think probably where perhaps I suspect we're in some agreement that if we just sort of apply these sort of tools that measure things like complexity or connectedness, or even statistical measures of things, it's really only one perspective of what's going on. And so the way that I've phrased this in our approach is the mixture of quantitative and qualitative methodologies. And so it's the kind of thing that I would really love to do, which is to have high quality quantitative and high quality qualitative data about what people are experiencing with respect to what's going on in these group phenomena. What is the diversity of opinions? And to me, why that is so important is that it goes back to some of the motivation here in the first place, is that a neuron is sending a signal, but what the heck is that signal about? When you and I are in communication, what is it that we're talking about? How and what's the meaning of the information that we're sharing with each other? And I think that that obviously has profound causal effects on the world. If we look at the content of the information that's going around right now, there's a real diversity, some of which I would venture to say is fairly maladaptive for our country, and especially with respect to what you're suggesting in terms of conflict and even the idea of a civil war, things like this, right? So, I think that you could be really well connected up, and that could be the information that's reverberating through your network, right? So there's this sort of meaning and there's a significance of it, even if it's well organized, perhaps. I'm not sure, So and so it's the marriage of those two approaches, right? Is I think that the quantitative level gives us a better picture of some of the dynamics, and it's hard to capture that. We're just talking to one person at a time.
Yeah, you have to, and we have to appreciate the extreme challenges, methodological challenges, which exist at the social level in addition to the neuronal level. In one of your studies that I read, you're trying to infer causation from correlation, and so you have this data set. It's time series analysis, longitudinal data, and stuff like that, and of course there's many things that are correlated, but what you're trying to tease apart is what's causal. What sense is something causing something else within this very, very complex system based on the data that you have available. There's huge algorithms that are required in order to do that. But if you succeed, even if you succeed, all you've succeeded in showing, I'm not disparaging this at all, is A cause B, and we don't know the good effect or bad effect. So really they're working out a causal answer is only partway towards a functional answer. Was A causing B to good effect or bad effect? So that's how complicated it is. On the one hand, just to work out the causal structure, what's causing what in a complex system is hard enough. And then to work out, to be able to understand that in any kind of functional term is different. I won't say harder still, because I think it is possible to do it, but it's just different. And so yeah, I mean, if some of the things I'm saying sound critical, I hope they don't, frankly. I think that this is what we need to do. Difficult work, but anyhow, so this is all great, Michael. And so I think this has been a wonderful conversation, and I think I've had my say. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we bring this to a close?
That's a good question. I mean, I certainly had some questions for you at some point, but we can decide whether or not they're worth if we want to have another conversation at another time to go into. I on this particular issue though here of causality, I think part of what motivates this, at least I think at least for us, right, is that one of the things about science and exploring complex systems is that we're finding things that are sort of unexpected, or things that are clearly hard to predict, and so I think that's part of the motivation. Is it's like, okay, well, where should we be looking next? What kind of things are going on? And once we get that perspective, then we can say, okay, now we sort of drill down. There's clearly, we talked briefly about relationships, right? I mean, there's clearly, people may have a dynamic in a relationship, or in a family or in a culture, and so we can maybe get the sense that there's this something there. And so then but first we need that sense that there's something there. Then we can start to drill down and wonder more about what's the meaning of that. And so it's kind of by going between those levels that I think can yield fruitful scientific process.
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, it's an early stage of discovery, basically, discovery stage, where more or less you're saying, what's going on here? But the fact that you need such technology in order to ask that simple question is what makes it challenging. But we are at that stage, and so therefore, that's a fine question to ask, guided by theory as much as possible. And I also want to say that this project of the Human Energy Project, bringing together these scientists and sponsoring our research and basically addressing these questions, is a great thing. So I'm grateful for the support of the Human Energy to be able to have these conversations and to focus the research and so on and so forth. I think it's identifying a set of questions which have not been, I mean, of course they've been asked in some ways, but to create the focus and to bring it together and to tie everything, this whole arc from the origin of life all the way up to the prospect of global cooperation and everything in between, multicellular organisms, social insect colonies, small human groups, large human groups, to tie all that together in a conceptually coherent bundle is no small feat in its own right. So thank you so much for taking part, and we will be interacting again, or at least we can, moving forward, because we're part of a community that's been assembled by this kind of inquiry.
Wonderful. Yes. Well, thank you very much. It's been really an enjoyable conversation. And I too would just, of course, echo that. I think that what the Human Energy Project, I think, is allowing for me and in my research that I think is relevant to add here in our closing is that there's the story element of it, right? We're weaving together multiple disciplines, right? And so it's not merely the sense that we're just going off on a scientific expedition to understand a particular phenomena, but we're wondering about the sort of the meaning of that phenomena to us and our fellow human beings on this process.
Yeah, and that story needs to be told at several levels. I mean, what we're doing is a story at a very high level. I mean, not everyone's going to be able to follow this conversation and the other conversations in the science of the noosphere section. These are deep dives, but they're also deep dives in a way that at that level, at that very high professional level, it is a form of storytelling that is bringing people together from quite different disciplines that actually do not have you're not all on the same page. So I regard this kind of conversation as a form of storytelling, which goes alongside another level of storytelling that reaches a much wider audience and so on and so forth. So the idea that there needs to be levels of storytelling, levels of narrative, And a theory is nothing more than a narrative that's highly accountable to science.